Hi everyone, this is APUSH Chapter 17 review, and we'll be talking about Manifest Destiny and its legacy. And we'll begin with the Whig Party. William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig, was elected in 1841, and John Tyler was elected vice president. His cabinet had Secretary of State Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay was still in the Senate, the uncrowned king of the Whigs. Harrison contracted pneumonia and died after only 4 short weeks in office. He by far had the shortest administration in American history, but gave the longest inaugural address, 2.5 hours outside without a coat on. John Tyler was basically Tyler 2, that part of the Whig ticket, and he now claimed the spotlight. He was stubbornly attached to principle. He resigned earlier from the Senate rather than accept a distasteful instruction from the Virginia legislature. He left the Jacksonian Democrats for the Whigs, and enemies accused him of being a Democrat in Whig clothing. Tyler was at odds with the majority of the Whigs. The Whig Party platform was pro-bank, pro-protective tariff, and pro-internal improvements. Tyler, too, rhymed with Tippecanoe, but there is where the harmony ended. Harrison, the Whig, served for only 4 weeks, whereas Tyler, the ex-Democrat but largely a Democrat at heart, served for 204 weeks. The Whigs' platform outlined a strong nationalist campaign program. The financial reform came first. The Whig Congress passed a law ending the independent treasury system. President Tyler, disarmingly agreeable, signed it. Clay drove through Congress a bill for a fiscal bank which would recreate a new Bank of the United States. Clay, who was the great compromiser, would have done well to conciliate Tyler. Tyler vetoed the bill on both practical and constitutional grounds. The Whig leaders tried again, passing another bill providing for a fiscal corporation. Tyler again vetoed the offensive substitute. The Democrats were jubilant. The Whig extremists condemned Tyler as his accidency and even executive ass. He was formally expelled from the Whig Party, and the entire cabinet resigned except for Secretary of State Webster, who was then in the midst of delicate negotiations with England. The proposed Whig tariff Tyler vetoed, and he disagreed with the Whig scheme for distributing to states revenue from the sale of public lands in the West. He believed that this would squander the federal money. He chastised Clayites and redrafted the tariff bill. He removed the dollar distribution scheme, lowered the rates to moderately protective levels of 1832, roughly 32% on dutiable goods, and Tyler reluctantly signed the tariff of 1842. There were anti-British passions during this time period. At the bottom lay bitter memories of 2 Anglo-American wars. The pro-British Federalists had died out. British travelers wrote negatively about American customs in travel books. These writings touched off a third war with England. Fortunately, this British-American war was fought on paper only, and only ink was spilled. This is a British cartoon that reflected the contemptuous view of American culture and politics and diplomacy that was common in Britain during this time period. America was a borrowing nation. They had expensive canals to dig and railroads to build. Britain, with overflowing coffers, was a lending nation. During the Panic of 1837, several states defaulted on bonds or repudiated them altogether. In 1837, a short-lived insurrection erupted in Canada. Hot-blooded Americans furnished military supplies or volunteered for armed service, and the Washington regime tried to maintain neutrality. But it could not enforce unpopular laws in the face of popular opposition. This provocative incident on the Canadian frontier brought passions to boil in 1837. The American steamer, the Caroline, was carrying supplies to insurgents across the Niagara River. It was attacked by the British and set on fire. The craft sank short of the falls, but only 1 American was killed. This was an unlawful invasion of American soil and had alarming aftermaths. In 1840, a man named McLeod, who confessed to being involved in the Caroline raid, was arrested and indicted for murder. London made clear his execution would mean war. Fortunately, McLeod was freed after establishing an alibi. The tensions renewed in 1841 when British officials in the Bahamas offered asylum to 130 Virginian slaves who had rebelled and captured the American ship the Creole. Britain had abolished slavery within the empire in 1833, raising Southern fears that its Caribbean possessions would become Canada-like havens for escaped slaves. There was also a Maine boundary dispute during this time period, and the St. Lawrence River was icebound for several months of the year. As a defensive precaution, the British wanted to build a road west from the seaport Halifax to Quebec. The road would go through the disputed territory named by Maine, and the Aroostook War threatened to widen into a full war. Britain sent to Washington a non-professional diplomat named Lord Ashburn, who established cordial relations with Secretary Webster. They agreed to the compromise on the Maine boundary that can be seen on the map in 17.1. This split-the-difference arrangement entailed Americans retaining 7,000 square miles of a 12,000 square mile of wilderness in dispute, and Britain got less land but won the desired Halifax-Quebec route. This is the map of the Maine boundary settlement in 1842, and you can see where the Webster-Ashburn Treaty Line is shown in red, and the proposed road route from Halifax to Quebec is seen here in blue. The Caroline Affair patched up by exchange of diplomatic notes. Basically, there was a bonus in small print as well. The British, in adjusting the U.S.-Canadian boundary farther west, surrendered 6,500 square miles. This area was later found to contain priceless Mesabi iron ore of Minnesota. Now we're going to talk about the Lone Star of Texas. Texas had a very precarious existence. Mexico, during this time period, after Texas independence, had refused to recognize them as independent. They regarded the Lone Star Republic as a province in revolt to be reconquered in the future, and Mexican officials threatened war if the United States ever annexed Texas. Threatened by Mexico, Texas maintained costly military defenses. They also negotiated with Britain and France to secure a defensive shield of a protectorate. In 1839 and 1840, Texans concluded treaties with France, Holland, and Belgium. Britain and France were interested in an independent Texas to help block further American expansion. Other foreigners were interested in Texas as well. The British abolitionists hoped to end slavery in Texas. British merchants regarded Texas as an important free trade area, an offset to the tariff-walled United States. And British manufacturers hoped that Texas could produce enough cotton to reduce Britain's chronic dependence on American fiber. Texas became a leading issue in the 1844 presidential campaign. Foes of expansion assailed annexation. The Southern hotheads cried, "Texas or disunion." Pro-expansionist Democrats under James K. Polk defeated the Whigs, and the lame duck President Tyler interpreted a narrow Democratic victory as a mandate to acquire Texas. Tyler deserves the credit for shepherding Texas into the fold and bringing Texas into the Union. Despairing after securing the necessary two-thirds vote in the Senate for a treaty, Tyler sought annexation by joint resolution. After a spirited debate, the resolution passed in 1845, and Texas formally was invited to become the 28th state. Mexico angrily charged Americans had despoiled it and had stolen Texas. But clearly, by 1845, it was clear that Mexico would not be able to retake Texas. By 1845, the Lone Star Republic had become a danger spot. It invited foreign intrigue that menaced the American people. The continued existence of Texas as an independent nation threatened to involve the United States in other wars, and the United States can hardly be accused of haste in achieving annexation, as it took them 10 years to do so, and for 10 years, Texas was its own republic. This is a picture of the St. Louis in 1846, where this is what thousands of pioneers would have seen pulling away from St. Louis and saying farewell to civilization. Next, we'll talk about the Oregon Country. The geography of the Oregon Country, from the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean and north of California to the 5440 parallel, is the area that we're going to discuss, which is the present southern tip of Alaska and the Panhandle. This was claimed at one time or another by Spain, Russia, Britain, and the United States. Two claimants dropped out of the competition. Spain dropped out through the treaty which gave the United States Florida in 1819, and Russia retreated to the 5440 line by the treaties of 1824 and 1825. The British claims to Oregon were strong, especially the portion north of the Columbia River, and this was based on prior discovery and exploration, treaty rights, actual occupation, which means British people lived there, and the colonizing agency, which was the Hudson's Bay Company. Americans also had claims to Oregon. They had explored and occupied it as well, and Captain Robert Gray in 1792 had stumbled onto the Columbia River, which he named after his ship. The famed Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 found a Pacific route through this area to the Pacific Ocean. The presence of missionaries and other settlers, some of whom reached the Willamette Valley, helped settle and occupy the area. These missionaries, in trying to save the soul of the Indians, were instrumental in saving the soil of Oregon for the United States. They stimulated interest in a faraway domain that many Americans earlier assumed would not be settled for centuries, and scattered Americans and British pioneers lived there peacefully side by side. The Anglo-American Convention of 1818 was when the United States wanted to divide this area at the 49th parallel. The British wanted the Columbia River as the dividing line, so a scheme for peaceful joint occupation was adopted, pending future settlement. A handful of Americans in the Willamette Valley was multiplied in the early 1840s by Oregon fever, so there was a rush to Oregon to help occupy the area. This is a picture of a general store in Omaha City, Nebraska. Settlers would stop here for provisions before venturing further west across the open plains. Over 2,000 miles was how long the trail was to Oregon, and there were 5,000 Americans that had settled south of the Columbia River by 1846. The British could only muster 700 north of the Columbia River, so it's actually only a relatively small area that was in dispute in 1845. Americans proposed the line at the 49th parallel. The British again offered the line at the Columbia River, and the issue was now tossed into the presidential election of 1844, where it became overshadowed by the question of annexing Texas. This is a caricature of the spirit of manifest destiny that swept the nation in the 1840s and threatened to sweep it to extremes. This is an 1848 cartoon that lampoons the pro-slavery Democratic presidential candidate, Lewis Cass, as a war machine bent on conquest of territory ranging from New Mexico to Cuba and even Peru. Two major parties were nominated in the election of 1844. The Whigs selected Henry Clay, and James Polk from Tennessee was chosen by the Democrats. He was America's first dark horse candidate. The campaign was an expression of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was a sense of mission, believing that God had manifestly destined the United States to occupy all of the present-day United States, so all of the North American area that we now basically occupy. Expansionist Democrats were strongly swayed by manifest destiny. Their platform was reannexation of Texas and reoccupation of Oregon all the way to the 5440 parallel. All of Oregon or none, the slogan 5440 or fight, was not coined until 2 years later. They condemned Clay as a corrupt bargainer, a dissolute character, and a slave owner. The Whigs, on the other hand, countered with their own slogans. They spread lies that a gang of Tennessee slaves had been on their way to a slave market branded with the initials JKP for James K. Polk. Clay straddled the crucial issue of Texas. While he personally favored annexation, he also favored postponement to appeal to the North. This was a picture called "The Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way." This is a romantic tribute to the spirit of manifest destiny, commissioned by Congress, and is still currently seen in the Capitol building in Washington. The election results: Polk nipped Clay 170 electoral votes to 105 electoral votes in the Electoral College. He also won the popular vote. Clay would have won if he had not lost New York State by a mere 5,000 votes. A tiny anti-slavery Liberty Party absorbed nearly 16,000 votes that would have gone to Clay. So that party, that third party, actually did affect the election. The Democrats proclaimed they received a mandate from the voters to take Texas. And as a result, President James Polk takes office as president. He was not an impressive figure. His workload was increased by his unwillingness to delegate authority. He was methodical and hardworking, but not brilliant. Shrewd, narrow-minded, conscientious, and persistent, and he developed a 4-point program. With remarkable success, he achieved it completely in less than 4 years. His 4-point program was, number 1, to lower the tariff. The Secretary of Treasury, Robert Walker, devised a tariff for revenue bill that reduced the average rates of tariffs, especially the tariff of 1842, from 32% to 25%. With strong support from low-tariff Southerners, the Walker tariff bill made it through Congress. Complaints came from Middle States and from New England as a result, but the bill proved to be an excellent revenue producer. This shows the House vote on the tariff of 1846. It shows for and against, and then also by region. He also wanted to restore the independent treasury, which was unceremoniously dropped by the Whigs in 1841. The pro-bank Whigs in Congress raised a storm of opposition, but Polk was successful in 1846. Third and fourth points on Polk's list were acquisition of California and a settlement of the Oregon dispute. This is the Oregon controversy as shown through a map in 1846. The settlement of the Oregon dispute required reoccupation of the whole and had been promised to Northern Democrats in the 1844 campaign. The Southern Democrats, who were once Texas was annexed, pretty much cooled off. Polk, feeling bound by the 3 offers of his predecessor to London, proposed the line at the 49th parallel. The British anti-expansionists now believed that Columbia River was not the St. Lawrence of the West, and Britain in 1846 proposed the line at 49 degrees. Polk threw the decisions to the Senate. They speedily accepted the offer and the subsequent treaty. Satisfaction with Oregon settlement among the Americans was not totally unanimous, though. Polk, despite all the campaign bluster, got neither 5440 nor a fight. But he did get something that in the long run was better. He got a reasonable compromise without a rifle raised. This is Fort Vancouver in the Oregon country. Next, we have some additional misunderstandings with Mexico. Faraway California was another worry for Polk. It had a diverse population, Spanish Americans, Indians, and some foreigners, but mostly Americans. They had given time these transplanted Americans might bring California into the Union, but Polk was eager to buy from Mexico. So Mexico owed the United States some $3 million for damages to American citizens and their property. The more serious contention was over Texas. Deadlocked with Mexico, the United States was deadlocked with Mexico over Texas boundaries. Texas wanted the boundary at the Rio Grande River, and Mexico sought the boundary at the Nueces River. Polk was careful to keep the U.S. troops out of no man's land, which is the land in between. California continued to cause Polk anxiety, though. There were rumors that the British wanted to buy or seize California, and Americans could not accept that under the Monroe Doctrine. Polk dispatched a man named John Slidell to Mexico City in 1845 to offer $25 million for California and the territory to the east. Mexico would not even permit Slidell to present his offer. Polk decided to force a showdown, and January 13, 1846, he ordered 4,000 men, along with General Zachary Taylor, to march from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande, hoping to start a fight. When nothing happened, he informed the cabinet on May 9, 1846, that he proposed to declare war because of the unpaid claims by Mexico and the rejection of Slidell. News of the bloodshed arrived the same night, and the Mexican troops had crossed the Rio Grande to meet General Taylor. Polk sent a vigorous war message to Congress. Congress overwhelmingly voted for war. In the message to Congress, Polk was making history, but he was not writing a balanced account. The spot resolution, issued by Abraham Lincoln, demanded information as to the precise spot on American soil where American blood had been shed, insinuating that that General Taylor had stepped onto Mexican soil, and that's where the blood had been shed. So did Polk provoke war? California was imperative in his program, and he really needed it, and Mexico would not sell it at any price. So Polk wanted California, and he pushed a quarrel to a bloody showdown. Both sides were spoiling for a fight. Both sides were fired by moral indignation. Mexicans wanted to fight the bullies of the North, and many Americans sincerely believed that Mexico was the aggressor. So Polk wanted California, not war. But when war came, he wanted to fight on a limited scale and then pull out when he got what he wanted. Santa Anna convinced Polk that he would betray Mexico, but then he drove his countrymen to a desperate defense of their soil. American operations in the Southwest and California were completely successful. Both General Stephen Kearny and Captain John Fremont had success in the West. Fremont collaborated with American naval officers and local Americans who hoisted the banner of the short-lived California Bear Flag Republic. This is a map of the major campaigns of the Mexican War. General Taylor defeated the Mexicans in several battles and then reached Buena Vista on February 22nd and 23rd, 1847. This is where 5,000 of his troops repulsed an attack by 20,000 troops under Santa Anna. Taylor became the hero of Buena Vista. He also, however, could not defeat Mexico decisively in the semi-deserts of northern Mexico. He needed a crushing blow at the enemy's vitals, which was to be Mexico City. General Winfield Scott succeeded in battling his way to Mexico City by September of 1847. One of the most brilliant campaigns in U.S. history was waged, and Scott proved to be the most distinguished U.S. general between the American Revolution and the Civil War. Scott and his chief clerk of State Department, Nicholas Trist, arranged an armistice with Santa Anna, which would cost $10,000. Polk ordered Trist home, but he wrote a 65-page letter explaining why he could not come home. Trist signed the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo on February 2, 1848, and forwarded it to Washington. In the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, it confirmed the American title to Texas. It yielded an enormous area stretching to Oregon, the ocean, and embracing California. The total expanse was about half the size of Mexico. The United States agreed to pay $15 million for land and to assume claims of its citizens against Mexico. And we can read more about the Californios who were living in that area in Makers of America in the chapter. This is a picture of the telegraph keeping the nation informed of the events in far-off Mexico. This was storming the fortress at Chapultepec, Mexico, 1847. Success at Chapultepec contributed heavily to the final victory over Mexico. Polk submitted the treaty to the Senate. The anti-slavery Whigs in Congress, dubbed the Mexican Whigs, or the Conscience Whigs, denounced the damnable war. Another peril impended. A swelling group of expansionists clamored for all of Mexico. If America had seized it, she would have been saddled with an expensive and vexatious policing problem. The victors rarely pay an indemnity, but Polk arranged to pay a ton of money after winning. Critics claimed the Americans had a guilty conscience. Apologists pointed proudly to Anglo-Saxon spirits of fair play. As wars go, the Mexican War was a small one. It cost 13,000 American lives, mostly by disease. But the fruits of the war was enormous. America's total expanse was increased by 1/3. It proved to be a blood-spattering schoolroom for the Civil War, as a lot of the people who were generals during this conflict or who entered the military would participate in the Civil War. The campaigns provided a priceless experience for the Army, and the Navy was valuable in blockading Mexican ports. The Marine Corps won new laurels and to this day sings in its stirring hymn about the halls of Montezuma. The Army waged war without defeat and without a major blunder. Opposing armies emerged with increased respect for each other. The Mexicans never forgot that the United States tore away about half of their country, and it marked an ugly turning point in relations between the United States and Latin America. War aroused the slavery debate that did not stop until the Civil War. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced an amendment that slavery should never exist in any of the territories gained from Mexico. This was called the Wilmot Proviso, and it never became law, but it was endorsed by legislatures of all but one of the free states and came to symbolize the burning issue of slavery in the territories. More than any other issue, the debate over slavery in the new western lands divided the North and South. From the perspective of history, the opening shots of the Mexican War were actually the opening shots of the Civil War. This is a picture of the rancheros whose way of life was extinguished when California became part of the United States. This is a picture of, or a map of, the Spanish missions and presidios that existed during that time period along the El Camino Road. And this is the chronology from the chapter.